Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 9, Section 2, the early stages of the Civil War. Take a look at our first main idea. The Civil War was a massive conflict in which both sides did everything they could to build up their forces. In number 1, the Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run made it clear that the North would need a large, well-trained army to defeat the South. The First Battle of Bull Run took place on July 21st, 1861. And if you know anything about Bull Run is actually the name of a creek that runs through the community of Manassas. And depending on if you live in the North or the South, will determine what you actually call this battle. In the North, we call it the First Battle of Bull Run. In the South, they call it the First Battle of Manassas. Needless to say, Union forces went into this battle thinking that they were going to basically end this war in one quick battle one day, and exactly the opposite took place. And probably most noted was one of the commanders from the Confederacy, a man named General Thomas J. Jackson, aka Stonewall Jackson. It's during this battle that he gets the name Stonewall. And it had a lot to do with what was happening on the battlefield. Jackson was an artillery specialist. He commanded troops in a way that might have been considered to be incredibly strict or stern, but he had the respect of his soldiers. And during this battle, he actually had been grazed by a bullet and had actually started bleeding. And his fellow officers were demanding that he leave the battlefront so he could go and have his wounds tended to. And he refused to leave. And hence he stood like a stone wall. And that's where the name comes from. Number 2, as the war dragged on and the casualties rose, fewer young men volunteered, forcing both governments of the North and the South to resort to something known as conscription. Conscription is a fancy name for a draft, and an individual who basically was roughly 18 to maybe 40 years of age was eligible to be drafted unless they could pay a bounty that would get them out of service. And what you would do with this bounty is you would pay someone else to serve in your place. There were some wealthier people who did this, and hence many of our soldiers of the Civil War were poor people because of the fact that they had to serve for themselves. Number 3. The main idea here, the Union Navy played an important role in defeating the Confederacy. And number 3, the Union used blockade runners to smuggle goods past the blockade, usually under the cover of night. Blockade runners were usually small boats, some maybe a little more fancier than others. And number 4, in spite of the powerful attack by the Confederates, all but 4 of the ships commanded by Union Admiral David D. Farragut survived to arrive at New Orleans on April 25th, 1862. Admiral Farragut, just so you know, he had been asked to go and to kind of capture the port of New Orleans going up the Mississippi. And what's interesting is there were several forts that were at the mouth of the Mississippi that he had to sneak past. And he was actually able to sneak past these forts and eventually capture the city without being detected. It made him very well known for being so stealthy. But a little side note here, David Farragut was actually a Spaniard. His father was from Spain, and he had ended up in the United States and got involved in the military, got involved in the Navy, and he's probably not necessarily remembered as one of our first Latino soldiers. or sailors in this case. Your next main idea. The Union experienced some important victories in the West. With the fall of Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, all of these are along the Mississippi, kind of in the western theater of the war. All of Kentucky and most of western Tennessee came under the Union military control. Kind of rising to fame was kind of a known name officer. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant was making a name for himself out on the battlefield for being kind of cool under fire. And eventually he is going to catch the eye of Abraham Lincoln in due time. Number 6, in the Battle of Shiloh, which again took place in the western theater of the war, Tennessee in this case, 20,000 troops were killed or wounded, more than in any battle up to that point. There will be bloodier battles in the Civil War, but the Battle of Shiloh was one of the first major bloody battles, and it did change the course of the war. The Union is starting to get an upper hand in the West. We no longer have to worry about states like Missouri perhaps falling to the Confederacy. Kentucky is going to be solidly Union, and Tennessee is not going to be a huge threat. So by taking this, we're kind of in that process of kind of strangling and dividing the South. And number 7, General Braxton Bragg hoped that his invasion of Kentucky would lead to what is known as an uprising of pro-Confederate supporters in the state. Your next main idea. While the Union and Confederate troops struggled for control of Tennessee and the Mississippi River, another major campaign took place in the East. In the Battle of the 7 Days, or the 7 Days Battle, both sides suffered roughly 30,000 casualties. And shortly thereafter, in September of 1862, we had the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day, one day, in American history, with over 6,000 killed in action. That's what KIA stands for, and up to about 10,000 wounded. This battle was unique because it was the first time that the Confederates had actually taken the war to the North. We're going to talk a little bit more about this battle in a video that we're going to watch, but it is this battle that Lincoln was kind of waiting for. Even though Antietam is not what I would consider to be a solid Union victory, because there were a lot of flaws here. Matter of fact, the battle itself could have been the last battle of the Civil War had the Union pursued the Confederacy, because they were seriously wounded that day, and it was possible that we could have finished up this war at that moment. But instead, our general of the time in the North, General McClellan, decided to allow the Confederates to retreat without going after them. So this supposable victory at Antietam convinced Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He had written this up, had shown it to members of his Congress, or not Congress, but his cabinet, as you see pictured here. And many of them basically said, this isn't the time. We need a victory first before you can actually issue this document. And so after this victory, Abraham Lincoln issues this emancipation, which basically said it would free all enslaved persons in states that were in rebellion. In other words, if you were a slave in, let's say, Tennessee or Texas or Alabama, you would be freed after January 1st, 1863. It would not necessarily release from slavery any person who was enslaved who was living outside of the states of rebellion. So if you were living in Kentucky or Missouri or, let's say, Maryland, it had no impact. And that's the reason why a lot of people kind of wonder what was the real power of this emancipation. I mentioned before the Battle of Antietam being a very bloody battle. There is one little place on the battlefield that is kind of unique. I've been to Antietam, and this is a photo that I took of what is known as the Sunken Road, but also known during the battle as the Bloody Lane. This actually is kind of like a trench. And what's interesting is during kind of the second phase of this battle, many of our Confederate troops were basically lying low here, waiting for the Union to come march upon them. And as they kind of were hiding in this sunken road, they were able to pick off many Union soldiers. But the overwhelming numbers of Union soldiers eventually overtook these Confederates. And what ends up happening is so many of them are slaughtered that their bodies, for the most part, are literally 3 to 4 deep, and they covered the entire trench here. And the story was the following day is that you wouldn't step on the ground when you were crossing Bloody Lane because there were so many bodies that were there. Thank you very much.